Hey, I'm Matt. Welcome to my podcast, The Imagining, a time to explore the imagination, creativity, and mental health. All of the conversations I'm having form part of the research for my new book. I hope that you have the opportunity during this time to discover something new about yourself. Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming. Welcome to my workspace. I know that this is probably quite a strange experience for you.
Yeah, really weird.
Have you ever been on a podcast before?
Never ever.
Okay, so although you've not been on podcasts, what have you done in your life?
Oh my word.
It's like, what are the other things apart
Okay.
from podcasts that you do? What's kind of a daily life for you look like?
Daily life for me. So I'm a mum of 3, wife to Terry, and I work full time as a community pastor for Skylark Church in Chelmsford. So that's my day to day.
Yeah.
There's a lot. It's really varied, literally varied every single day, which is exactly how I like it. I get bored very easily, so I am a creative in that sense that I can't just stick in one particular area.
What does bored very quickly feel like?
The need to run, flightiness, like that I'm being caged and I need to break free.
Did
That's
you
what it feels
grow
like.
up? Because the idea of boredom is a really strong theme in my thinking around my writing, and this idea that is it okay to be bored? And I know that we hear quite a lot at the moment about, let's teach our children how to be bored because of attention and problems like that. But I'm kind of like a radical anti-boredom kind of person.
Sure.
I don't really think that boredom really achieves anything. I think stillness does.
Yep. And slowness. Yeah.
But I wouldn't necessarily equate them together. So do you kind of agree? What's your thoughts around boredom? Is it useful or?
So my mum always used to say, only boring people get bored, which was possibly a little bit of a challenge because I often felt bored and I was like, am I boring? Is that the issue here? But I think there is a sense that you can create your own excitement.
Right.
And so I've always kind of looked for that. And so when things are no longer exciting, that's when I'm like, oh, well, I'm bored and I need to find another thing.
Yeah.
So there's this drive for more always that I've had since I was really, really young. But in terms of boredom being a positive thing, I'm kind of with you here. I don't find anything positive about being bored at all. And that might just be the kind of person that I am. But yeah, boredom for me just means, get me out of here.
Does your household agree with the premise, or have you got people that?
Unfortunately, I have bred 3 of the same characters as me, so they have the same issue with boredom. Definitely.
So it's just like a daily grind against boredom.
Yeah.
How do you fight? How do you combat that boredom? Because like I said, maybe we could distinguish a little bit here between boredom and stillness.
Yeah.
How do you work with that? Like, if you obviously we want to mitigate against boredom because assuming that boredom is not really a healthy place to be in, it might be a healthy place, but stillness is. How do you make sure or help your kids and help yourself to not feel bored, but still to value stillness?
It's a really tricky one. So for me, the difference is whether I'm enjoying it or not. I can enjoy stillness and I can enjoy being slow, but I can't enjoy boredom. So that's the differentiation for me.
Right.
I absolutely love stillness. I love being on my own. I love slowing everything down and just taking the moment in. But boredom's a very, very different thing for me. Boredom's where my mind is racing, but it's got nowhere to land, almost.
Yeah.
So that's where I kind of find the difference. Whereas when I'm still, my mind's okay with being still.
Wow. That's really beautiful, actually. So there's this image that I always I talk about it mainly in reference to my marriage and my relationship with Jess, where my mind is like a stormy ocean and then Jess is something of like a still island within that. Yeah. And I guess that's kind of that thing. Boredom is just it's still chaotic. Even though it looks still, it can still be chaotic and mad and lots of movement and very unsettled.
Yeah.
How do you help? I mean, maybe you could talk about life as a family for you, but how do you help your kids do that?
With great difficulty, actually, because I think it's something that comes with age and time and understanding. So I've got 3 neurodivergent children, which is a challenge in itself. And certainly my middle child, she has complex mental health needs as well as her neurodivergence. So she's autistic and ADHD, and has complex depression and anxiety disorders. And for her, boredom is a real trigger. She finds it very, very difficult, and she finds it really hard to self-regulate when she's in a bored place. So what we try and encourage her to do when she's in that space is to ground herself, to try and slow down her thought processes and to find something that she enjoys. So she has like a list of things that will bring her out of a negative place or a bored space, that she'll just use, and she'll try every single one until she reaches somewhere. Sometimes she doesn't, and she has to stay in that place, and it's really uncomfortable, and she finds it really hard, and it's really, really hard to watch. But other times she's able to pull herself out of it by using some of the coping strategies that she's developed over the years. So for her, it's often creative art. She draws maps, like really detailed maps, that sometimes focuses her mind enough to get over the boredom. But yeah, it's different with all three of them.
It's so interesting, actually. And I had no idea that this was going to be the first kind of subject that we would hit on. But I'm recording my first episode on my own after this. I told you just before this. And one of the things that I think that I want to speak about, and that we'll find out, is this idea that certainly during my time at uni, I had this real deep struggle with my mind being bored. And thereby my attention landed on some really unhelpful things and intrusive thoughts almost. Like it felt like I was so unchallenged, so unstimulated, just by, not by design, not by anyone doing anything wrong, but I was working in an environment where I wasn't around lots of people all the time, had quite a lot of time on my own, and I wasn't particularly enjoying what I was studying. And thus my brain started just being a bit of a rampant creative factory and creating all kinds of like horrible things, like what happens if you got cancer and died tomorrow?
Sure.
And then the prevalent kind of thought processes for a week were that.
Yeah.
And in some ways it was created by boredom, that all of this creative energy that wasn't being pushed into let's call it a helpful space, was getting pushed into this thing which was like really negative for me. And obviously we need that thought process on the basis that, you know, if you found a lump somewhere, you need something to trigger saying I should go to the doctors and I should go check that out, and that's obviously healthy. But then you really don't want to stick that thought process out. And actually that's why I started my media company. I'm going to go into my episode on my own, everyone. So if you're interested in the start of that story, then there'll be more of that coming. But I wonder whether, because you've recently qualified as a counsellor.
I have.
Is there anything that, let's say, speaking to a younger version of myself here, because I went and saw various different types of counsellors.
Sure.
What's your kind of thoughts around that? If someone came presenting that kind of feeling of just like, I can't land my creativity, they probably wouldn't express themselves like that. They would probably just say, I'm feeling really anxious.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's quite common?
I think it's becoming more and more common. And certainly with neurodivergence added in there as well, I think it becomes even more complex. So if I was to see a client that came in displaying anxiety and not quite knowing where it was coming from, and explaining those feelings of boredom and then leading to thoughts that are basically going out of control or going down a rabbit hole, then we would start working with catching the thought early and then changing it to a more positive one. But it takes a lot of work, like a huge amount of work. And certainly it's not something that's an overnight fix. And sometimes your default behaviours just keep coming back. And so it's not something that is necessarily totally fixable, but it is there are some tools that you can use to help you from going down those rabbit holes each time. So that would be probably the first thing I would work with you on, would be to go, right, okay, can you catch it early enough to change it?
Right, okay. How do you catch it early enough?
Well, it's self-awareness ultimately, which, you know, some people have loads of and some people really don't have very much. And that's where you'd work for quite a long time with a counsellor and become more self-aware, become realising that it might not be a thought in your head, it might be a feeling in your body, and try to articulate where that initial thought process comes from and then deal with it in that way.
And I guess that leads to the question. I promise I'm going to ask you some more open-ended, less intense questions after this as well.
Fine.
How did you develop your self-awareness? Because I think you're so right. I think self-awareness is here, right on the head here.
Yeah.
Like being aware of what you're thinking.
Many years of counselling, ultimately. So I was first diagnosed with anxiety and depression when I was about 8 or 9 years old, which is extremely young.
Yeah, particularly as well. I'm guessing, was this in the...
Quite a long time ago, Matt, yeah.
Would this be the 90s?
The 80s.
The 80s?
The 80s, in
Damn.
the 80s, I know, right?
You old. No, that's a joke.
But yeah, it was rare to have
That
been
must have been really
diagnosed.
odd, yeah.
I think possibly it was a misdiagnosis, and I was probably ADHD or autism.
Right.
But at the time, that just, especially in young girls, that would not have been
Yeah.
picked up at all. So we went down the counselling route. My mum and dad were amazing. I mean, the fact that they even sent me to the doctors
Yeah, for sure.
showed that they were a lot further along than a lot of people at that time. And so, yeah, I started on the journey of counselling when I was very, very young. And really, probably 20s before I started fully understanding who I was and what I was all about.
Right.
And then from there, that discovery has just grown and grown and grown. So, yeah, I would like to think that I'm very self-aware now after many, many years. However, I know there will be blind spots that I just don't see, and other people would be able to point out.
Do you actively practice self-awareness? I know that's a bit of a strange question, but is there anything that you do? I know that maybe you kind of do it by accident in the way that we breathe, in a sense, or subconsciously. But do you think you could identify any of them things that...
I think I definitely had to practice it at first. Now it feels like autopilot. But certainly when I was younger, it was something that I had to really explore and actually get comfortable with being quite uncomfortable with what I saw. I think we as human beings often hide, even from ourselves, the things that we don't like about ourselves, or we justify them in some way. So it could be that there was a trauma in my past, or there wasn't, but it could be that, or I could blame it on the fact that I was an ice skater and I was pushed too hard, or I was really competitive, or I was a perfectionist, or whatever it might be. I'll justify it with that, but it doesn't change the fact that it's actually quite a dark and an ugly part of myself that I didn't necessarily want to look at. So I think you have to be quite open to seeing something that you don't really want to see, and knowing that that doesn't necessarily have to stay the same, that can change and evolve, but you have to be able to look at it first. Which you have to be brave.
It really sucks, doesn't it? Basically,
really sucks.
Because I think that one of the ways in which I've grown recently, I think, is particularly, so I became a parent, obviously, like 13 weeks ago, and I caught myself doing this thing that I swore I would never do. I said I'm not going to be a proud parent, in the sense that I'm going to ask for help if I need it.
Yeah.
And then I noticed after a few weekends spent with the in-laws that I wasn't asking for help. I was very definitely pushing everyone away. And there was this moment where suddenly you have to sit down in blind ignorance for weeks of just it's all right, I got the baby. When really I'm like, damn, I don't got the baby.
I haven't got this baby at all.
This baby got me. And after that kind of burning process of actually fighting to be still for long enough, which obviously has practical challenges when you've got a baby, but it's got practical challenges when you have a job, when you have just life going. It can always be a practical problem to find stillness.
Yeah.
But sometimes just fighting for that moment, and I tried to fight for that moment, half got pushed into that moment by loving people in a loving way. But I think that search for self-awareness, and what I found as well was that obviously I'm a person who has big creative dreams and tries to pursue the wow or the adventure or whatever you would call it in your own life. There's definitely this sense of which, without the still bit, everything else just becomes like a snowball rolling downhill and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until crash and it all just falls apart because you didn't fight for them self-aware moment.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's zoom out for a second. What's you said that you're a community pastor.
Yep.
I've also heard around, just around the grapevine, just around stuff around the domestic abuse kind of thing.
Yeah.
I haven't spoken to anyone that like works in that field or thinks about that field. Maybe could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So we've been working in domestic abuse in that arena for about the last 2 years, and that's something that I brought to the role as I took it on, or just before I took it on actually. And that comes from my own experience when I was in my first marriage, which I was 20 when I got married. And up until that point, everything was reasonably okay from the outside in, although it turns out there was a lot of controlling behaviour and emotional abuse going on behind the scenes. But the minute the ring was on my finger, that relationship completely changed and it became physically abusive. And unfortunately, I was able to get out of that situation. But really, ever since then, I've always wanted to pay back something in that arena. So, yeah.
Pay back something because someone helped you, or just because you're like, I want to help people.
I just didn't want my
me.
experiences to be anybody else's.
Right.
And I know it is. Obviously, it is 1 in 4 people. But I just wanted to do something that would potentially help either people before they get to that stage. So we work quite a lot with young people about what a healthy relationship is and what to avoid and all that sort of thing. But also on the other side of that, when somebody has found themselves in a relationship like that and helping them to get out of it and then supporting them afterwards. I was incredibly fortunate to have a supportive family, amazing friends, a church surrounding me, loads of support networks, but not everybody has that around them.
1 in 4.
1 in 4.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And like that in the UK, obviously.
Yeah.
And then I'm guessing like around the world, them figures.
I think it's 1 in 3 around the world. 1 in 4 in the UK, 1 in 6 men, and that's not exclusive of anything. That's in churches. That's in every possible setting that you can imagine. It's 1 in 4.
That's unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think that how would a situation like that affect like creativity and imagination? Do you think?
Completely stifle it. I just don't think there's space for both. When you're in a situation where abuse is prevalent, everything in you is working to try and make that not happen. So you're just coming up with every possibility to avoid the perpetrator losing their temper with you, or not treating you in a way that's unacceptable, basically. Certainly before my relationship became physically abusive, I was still stifled. I was still completely restricted because I had to think about everything I did and said, because nothing was safe. There was no safety in that relationship, and therefore creativity just couldn't work.
Yeah,
it
just wasn't
there was
allowed
no space for
to
it.
move in.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I can't get over that stat of 1 in 4. That being the case, just because people listening to this podcast, is that what's the kind of advice around if you are, or if you think that you know someone? Just, I don't want to miss out on the opportunity to...
So if you think you are, I think if you are feeling restricted in any way by your partner, if you are feeling undermined, if you are feeling that you can't ever get it right, if there is fear in your relationship, then it's a pretty good indicator that something's not quite right there. If you're feeling isolated from friends and family, if that person is telling you that you need to spend all of your time with them and trying to remove any kind of sense of control from you, then you probably need to start questioning it. And if you're supporting somebody from the outside in, it's honestly the hardest thing that you'll ever do, because the reality is it's going to take them a long time to leave. And even if they do leave, the likelihood is they'll go back at least 7 times, because there's such power in that person, and there is such deep love from the victim to the perpetrator. It's a really difficult cycle to break. The best thing you can offer anybody in that situation is to believe them. Most people go back because they're not believed, or it's belittled, or they're told that it can't be that bad, or the person who's the perpetrator is so charming that you couldn't possibly believe that they would be doing that to the other person. So believe them is the most important thing, and have patience, because it's going to take them a little while, and it might be back and forth for a really long time.
Gosh, that's crazy. Is there like just because I'll add this at the end, is there like a a number or anything, or a website?
So we are partnering with a charity called Restored, who are fabulous, and we are a beacon church for them. So we have all our training through them. They are a safe place. There's a survivors network. There's all sorts of resources, and there's advice that you can get. You can speak to somebody anonymously. There's loads and loads of support out there. So that would be my go-to.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I'm working with Restored at the moment.
Oh, they're
actually.
amazing.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
amazing.
It's I've delved a little bit into the world of domestic abuse. That's a really weird sentence, isn't it? Yeah, it's unbelievable how big an effect it has
Huge.
in this country. I guess it's even like stats of modern day slavery and things like that. They're not gone.
It's so not gone.
It's like these
massive.
issues are so huge and still
is.
happening. Because one of the statements that I've been workshopping and discussing with a few different people is everyone's creative, not everyone's courageous.
Yeah.
Question mark. And the big question mark is obviously there's plenty of people being courageous. They've just got no courage left to be creative.
Yeah.
And I think that would apply in a lot of these areas like this, where
Definitely.
people are living in poverty, or they're experiencing domestic abuse or modern day slavery, or whatever it is all of the courage is gone.
Absolutely. The courage is going into surviving the day.
And it's just like you end up just like spending your whole day just trying to get through.
Yeah. And you're also not the same person on the other side. So my experience and what I see with lots of people that I work with is that when you come out the other side, you have lost all confidence in your own decision making, because you haven't been given the opportunity to make a decision for such a long time, often years and years and years. You stop believing in your ability to make good decisions for yourself. So for the first probably 2 years after that relationship, I had to get to know myself. I had to figure out who I was, what I liked, what I didn't like. I had no clue. I had no preference to anything, because it had almost been just drawn out of me. So the idea of striving for something was so far removed from my reality, because I couldn't see past my pain or my trauma. And until I dealt with that, there was no space for any kind of decisions. Even now, I'm really good at making big decisions, but small decisions I still really struggle with. So what I want to eat in the evening, Terry will tell you this, drives him absolutely crazy, because I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what I want. I have no idea. And it's partly because I make big decisions on the daily, and by the end of the day, I'm like, I'm done. But it's partly because that confidence in my own decision making was taken away from me.
How are you drawing that confidence back?
Again, a lot of work, a huge amount of self-work, trusting in who I was before and who I am now, and recognizing that they're not the same people. So I think it's just time and a lot of work.
Because I guess that speaks as well into lots of contexts with lots of different people in all kinds of situations of running out of courage, but running out of the ability to kind of, would you say, value yourself enough to have a choice?
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that piece on value is like incredibly important in terms of knowing that you're valuable enough to choose what you want for dinner. And that seems really like almost like a null point for someone who's lived a life like mine, where I haven't been subject to some of the things like that. But sometimes it's a creative win to choose what you want for dinner.
Absolutely. And you have to take it and be proud of yourself for it, which it just sounds ridiculous because it's such a small thing. But to be able to go, oh yeah, I chose what I wanted and I enjoyed it, is a really big thing.
And empower the people around us.
Yeah.
So one of the chapters in the book that I'm writing inevitably has to end up in a place of, you can do this journey of self-awareness and becoming more imaginative and less anxious, but you have to arrive at a point where what you've learned becomes the gift for someone around you, a bit like what you're saying. Yeah. Eventually you have to realize that if you have courage enough to be creative, you then need to give someone courage to be creative as 100%. Well. And that starts by, firstly, obviously making sure that they're safe.
Yeah.
And secondly, it can be a small thing like, no, like you can choose what we eat for dinner tonight. Yeah. And obviously that that maybe is a bit more of a niche example, but
Mm.
I'm sure that there's like this creative kind of fight is happening at all levels along the
Without
spectrum,
doubt.
isn't it?
Yeah, without
It's
doubt.
it's really amazing to me, almost encouraging when you walk down the street to understand that a lot of time people are creatively excelling
Mm-hmm.
when you begin to understand that creativity is happening
Yeah.
at all of them levels.
Yeah.
Like choosing what shoes you wear for the day can be a creative act, or choosing what shop you're going to shop in can be a creative act.
Yeah.
And I think that suddenly gives you eyes for the world around you that perhaps are a bit more, not rose tinted, but it helps you understand people in a more positive light.
Definitely, because we're not on an even playing field. So if you've had significant trauma in your life, you can't be as creative as somebody who's walked a fairly easy path. And it doesn't mean you're not as creative. It just means your circumstances are restricting you.
Do you feel like, obviously you've spoken about that journey, but you're the first person that I'm going to ask this question in this context. So I've been really interested by how culture has affected creativity and imagination and mental health. I've kind of avoided asking someone from the same culture as me that question, partly because one, it would reflect on me, and I don't know if I feel a little bit vulnerable about that. But two, I've always been like, is that an interesting question? But I think it probably is, because I guess every culture has an effect on every person. You said on my little form that you filled out that you filled out white British background.
Yeah.
Do you see that having any kind of impact on you still now in regards to your mental health and your creativity? I guess as well, you spoke about the fact that your parents really cared and thought about stuff like this early on, which could be one of the pros of white Western culture, is that maybe we got on the mental health thing quite, I don't want to say quickly, but because I'm sure there's been ancient cultures that kind of had this stuff figured out ages ago. But how do you feel that's affected you?
In every single way. And I don't think we can get away from it, and I can't get away from my privilege. As unfair as it is, I can't get away from it. So yeah, middle class family, white British, Christian upbringing, couldn't have wanted for anything in my life, had every opportunity given to me, everything I wanted I was encouraged into. Financially, I think it's huge, the difference that it makes for somebody to access creativity and mental health. The more financially secure you are, definitely the higher your chances of being able to stretch yourself creatively and to gain the help and support you might need with your mental health. So yeah, I just don't think there's anything that can possibly escape it. It influences every aspect of my life. Even now, as an adult who's got a history of trauma, and there's been a lot of stuff in my life that has been really traumatic. So it's not that I've managed to avoid negative impacts, but the way in which I've been able to get out of them has been eased by the fact that my culture is what it is.
That's really interesting, isn't it, actually? I like that. Just say that sentence again. Do you remember it?
I can't remember what I said.
I can't remember.
The fact I being able to get out of the situations I found myself in has been eased by my cultural background.
So even though it's not necessarily prevented it,
it
has been helped the road to recovery
without a doubt
smoother.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Gosh, I quite like that.
Well, just even the fact that, when I was 8 or 9 or 15 or 16 or whenever I had a particularly bad period in terms of my mental health, my mum and dad were able to fund it financially. So I didn't have to wait for the NHS to catch up or to recognise that it was a problem. They could just go, okay, well, we'll just fund it and we'll make sure you're okay.
Yeah.
That is privilege there. And we see it in our own children. We've been fortunate enough to be in a similar situation with our own children where if we'd have waited for the NHS, honestly, I don't know whether my daughter would still be alive. We were able to do it privately. Yes, it stretched us, it cost us a lot, but we had that privilege. And I work with people who don't, and it breaks my heart that it's not an even playing field.
Gosh, is anyone doing anything about that? I know that we're obviously trying the country's trying to get behind the NHS, I think.
Yeah. There are people who are trying to do things about that, but the reality is the NHS waiting list for a child with mental health issues is 2 years, at which point, you know, imagine the damage that can be done in that time. And it's not it's nobody's fault. It's a broken system. And yeah, I would love to be able to do something.
Do you feel like the community or a good friend, how much can they step in if they know, like you've just said, if they know a child who's on a waiting list for 2 years, like what can a community or a person listening to this kind of step in and do?
So it's really difficult with children, particularly because they can't access psychiatrists in the same way that we can as adults. So if you or I were struggling with our mental health, we'll go to the doctors and we'd be prescribed something and we'd be offered counselling. With a child, you can't go to the local GP. You have to go to a specialist psychologist who have got this massively long waiting list.
Yeah.
But there's no way of avoiding that, and there's no way of getting them medicated without that. So it's either you pay or there's nothing. And it's not like charities have got psychiatrists just on their
Because I
books.
guess there's a kind of a wealth of charitable counselling.
Absolutely.
Kind of
Yeah, you can't just do that. So in a lot of senses, you're kind of stuck waiting in this spiral unless you go privately.
Yeah.
There are, however, loads of things that communities can do. So they can offer like wellness groups, individual counselling at like a sliding scale rate, which is something that we do through the church. So it basically pay what you can afford rather than a full price, and that's subsidised by the charity. So there are things, but there's just not enough. There's nowhere near enough. The need is absolutely vast and the resource is tiny. So it is a broken system that desperately needs something. But in the meantime, I think it's just people having a greater understanding of what it is to be a child with mental health problems and how to hold them well while they're waiting.
And just, I guess that the education system's a pressure on that kind of world. And I mean, both me and you have a lot of mutual friends. And it probably including our own journeys through education and being teenagers, like we're well aware of the pain that neurodivergent children and children who are struggling battles with their mental health are kind of facing on the daily.
Definitely.
It's a really complex issue. But I think that one of the things that I've realized, just to encourage people as someone that struggled with my mental health, not quite as a child, but definitely as like a very, very early adult, is that the level of just people showing up and asking how are you, and people being there does make a difference, obviously, doesn't it? And I know that could be the difference between, you know, someone's life and not someone's life.
Absolutely.
It's just the idea that you've checked in on them.
Yeah, that consistency. One tip that I would always use is I'll always ask people twice if they're okay, because the first reply is always like, yeah, I'm fine, how are you? And if you ask again and go, no, come on, how are you really? You often get a different answer. So I'd always ask twice. And I think, just that consistency of checking in, even when that person's not giving you anything, not to give up and just think, oh, they don't want to talk, but to just keep asking the questions, really important.
Completely different question.
Yeah.
There's an exercise that someone uses to measure creativity.
Oh, okay.
And we're going to try it on you now.
Okay.
I would like you to name 5 uses for a brick.
For a brick? Throw it through a window. Like a yoga brick, so you could do press-ups with it. What else could you do with a brick? I mean, you could start building a wall, but that's a bit boring. You could paint it and make it into like a shelf, like a little shelf for little trinkets and things. That would be quite cool. Might do that in my daughter's room. One more. I can't think of anything else. I only have 4 ideas.
You only have 4 ideas, and one of them included building a wall. Oh, we're struggling. Oh no. It's really funny how you can ask someone a question like that. I've asked a few people that question, and people always go, "Oh no," they'd start panicking. And it's like, it's really, it can be quite an obscure question. I haven't heard many amazing ones, but I quite like the shelf one.
Oh, okay.
One of my friends who I asked on the podcast actually had a decorated brick in her lounge that she
Okay,
found
that's
in
cool.
the beach. So she literally is living out the creativity.
She really is.
The idea behind the question is that the further away the use that you can articulate the use for a brick from actually kind of building a wall, the quicker and more divergent your thinking abilities are, is that you can reach into a far kind of place, a far understanding, but not so far that it's just stupid.
Sure.
So it's like, there's no point saying a brick could be a spaceship.
Yeah.
Because obviously a brick, that's a stupid spaceship.
That'd be a really heavy spaceship.
I mean, it would be useless. Yeah. You are going nowhere on that spaceship. But it does make people laugh. So maybe it does have a use. It's a funny spaceship made out of bricks.
I like it.
So yeah, that's a little question. You're going to go home and going to think,
I should have said
this use. I should have said use.
What would you do with the brick?
No, I'm not answering.
Oh! You've had too long to think about it. It wouldn't be fair.
No, I haven't had to. No one's asked a question of me yet, and I'm too scared to reveal my inabilities.
I feel like this might need to be in the next one that you do on your own.
I'm gonna ask myself that question, but I can edit myself as much as I want, though. Can't I? So
yeah, it's cheating.
I'm gonna have just the best list of creative bricks. So let's round off the conversation, and I think this has been really helpful. Mm-hmm. What would be your advice for anyone that is pursuing, let's just call it a better life? Mm-hmm. I think that we don't need to like overcomplicate it here. Anyone that's pursuing a better life but is deeply struggling with their mental health, get
counselling would be the first thing. And if you're not in a position where you can access counselling, then find somebody that you can be 100% vulnerable with, and really explore who you are and why you are the way you are. One thing I always do with pretty much every client I start with is a timeline where we would literally go from like birth to now and go through every possible like up, down, big life event, small life event. And there's so many things that you don't even realise were important, but were. So figuring out why you think the way you do, I think is so important. And then you can work out what actually makes you happy. What is it that is going to make your life better? And then you can start working on it. But I just think everybody should have counselling in some way, shape or form. I think the world would be a better place if we just all understood ourselves a little bit better.
For sure. And
leave shame at the door.
Right.
Definitely.
Like what does that mean?
I just think while you're carrying shame, you can't do anything. And until you're ready to put it down and accept that what you've done, who you were. It doesn't have to come with you. I think that's the biggest release into freedom that you can have. So if you can just get to the point where you can accept the mistakes you've made, you can accept the bits about yourself that you don't particularly like and not be shameful about them, just accept that they are who you are and they've made you who you are, that is the most freeing thing that you can do.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this episode of The Imagining. I hope that you've had the opportunity to discover something new about yourself. If you wouldn't mind and you enjoyed listening, then I would be really appreciative if you subscribed on whatever channel you're listening on.